Welcome to this American Planning Association Asian and Pacific Islander Interest Group online event to discuss historical perspective and current actions of our communities. Historical perspectives because of the inequalities that many Asians and Pacific Islanders have faced in past decades and centuries in the US, and what current actions are being taken in light of disturbing incidents directed towards Asian and Pacific Islanders. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. We're glad you're here with us today. I am Hing Wong, Chair of the Asian and Pacific Islander Interest Group. We are privileged to have two tremendous speakers for our program today. Secretary Norman Mineta, who is 90 years young, will speak to us via a recorded video on the injustice of being sent to an internment camp when he was a child, to serving as a mayor of a large US city, to his service as a senator, and later as secretaries to two presidential cabinets, one for a Democratic president and one for a Republican president. Following Secretary Mineta will be Stop AAPI Hate co-founder Manjusha Kulkarni, who is the executive director for AAPI Equity Alliance. Manju will help us understand what we can do as we are targeted with hate. In just 2 years, Stop AAPI Hate has received over 10,000 reports of discrimination. Additionally, the AAPI community is the fastest growing racial group in the country, growing over 4 times as rapidly as the total US population. It is expected to double to over 47 million by 2060. At this time, I would like to give a brief overview of today's program. Hansen Ham, Special Projects Director for our interest group, will give an introduction of Secretary Mineta, and then we'll play his video. Following the video will be Todd Vanderdelot, Program Director for our interest group, introducing Manjusha Kulkarni. Manju will present her finding from Stop AAPI Hate. Following her presentation will be Q&A. You can use the chat feature to type in comments or questions. In the next few days, we will be emailing Manju's presentation to today's attendees. At the end of today's program, I'll give a brief summary of the presentations as well as mention upcoming activities for our interest group. This session is being recorded and will be posted when available. Hansen?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be in the United States, since we have participants probably from Hawaii all the way to the East Coast. It's my sincere pleasure and honor to introduce Norma Mineta at our second API virtual event. While Mr. Mineta was not able to attend this event in person, he has graciously recorded a special presentation just for the APA Asian Pacific Islander Interest Group. And I think you'll appreciate his personal reflections, as well as his very thoughtful and insightful words to guide our future work as planners. Mr. Mineta is the president and CEO of Mineta and Associates, and is the former US Secretary of Commerce and US Secretary of Transportation. He's well known for his work in transportation, including aviation, surface transportation and infrastructure, as well as his work on national security. He is also recognized for his accomplishments in economic development, science and technology, foreign and domestic trade, and civil rights. Mr. Mineta's career in public service is distinguished and very unique. For almost 30 years, Mr. Mineta represented San Jose, California, first on the city council, then as the mayor, and then as a member of the US Congress. Among Mr. Mineta's many accomplishments during his illustrious 22 years in Congress, he was the primary author of the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act of 1991, as we commonly refer to as ICE-T. He was also the co-founder of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. In 2000, President Bill Clinton appointed Mr. Mineta Secretary of Commerce. Secretary Mineta was known for his work on technology issues and achieving international cooperation and intergovernmental coordination on complex fisheries issues, and for streamlining the patent and trademark process. Then President George W. Bush appointed Mr. Mineta Secretary of Transportation, where he served until 2006. Following the horrific terrorist acts of September 11th, 2001, which he will speak to, Secretary Mineta guided the creation of the Transportation Security Administration, TSA, as we're all familiar with, an agency with now more than 65,000 employees. This marked the largest mobilization of a new federal agency since World War II. Recognized for his leadership, Mr. Mineta received numerous awards, including the prestigious Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor in the United States. We are most honored to have Mr. Mineta share his thoughts and provide us a historical perspective to begin this event. And while Mr. Mineta is not able to be here in person, please feel free to enter any comments you have in the chat session, and we will forward it to Mr. Mineta. Thank you very much. And Dan?
Hello, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I appreciate this opportunity to speak before the Asian and Pacific Islander Interest Group of the American Planning Association. I applaud the creation of the interest group and its goals to increase the visibility of Asian and Pacific Islander planners in the profession and to highlight the planning issues facing Asian and Pacific Islander communities in America. It is critical that these communities have an advocate and a voice. Your contributions will broaden and deepen the understanding of our diverse communities as today's and tomorrow's leaders. You have the formidable and important task of making our cities more equitable, stable, and inclusive for all residents. As urban planners, you understand the history of the Asian and Pacific Islander experience in America and how this history is reflected in today's cities and ethnic communities. Many of you have experienced racism yourselves and are aware of the systemic inequalities in our society. Through your work in shaping urban policies, you play an integral role in ensuring that the elusive American dream is accessible to all citizens and immigrants. As Asian and Pacific Islander planners, you will enrich the planning profession by sharing your life experiences, personal insights, and a common perspective. I am pleased to share with you my reflections on growing up as an Asian American in San Jose, California, being elected as the mayor of that city, and then serving in Congress and later in the cabinet for 2 presidents. As many of you know, as a young boy, I was faced with a choice of whether to believe in the American ideal or to harbor a resentment because my family had been denied the blessings of liberty promised by the Constitution. In November 1941, I had just turned 10 years old. My family lived a normal and pleasant life in our hometown of San Jose, California. My dad, who had immigrated to America from Japan as a 14-year-old in 1902, and not knowing that much about geography, wanting to get to his uncle in Salinas, California, about 120 miles south of San Francisco. He got off the ship in Seattle. That's where he was now 800, 900 miles away from where he should be. And so it took him a year and a half to work from one labor camp to another to get to Salinas. And when he got to Salinas, his uncle put him in the first grade. And he said it was the most humiliating thing he ever did. Not because he didn't know English, but he was 5'3". Some of the students in that school were as tall as he was. So eventually my dad became an insurance agent and ran it out of our family home, the house in which I was born. It is near what was then, and still is, proudly called Japantown. On December 7, 1941, when the Empire of Japan attacked our American fleet at Pearl Harbor, it was an act of war. And as President Franklin Roosevelt put it so memorably, quote, "a day that will live in infamy," unquote. 2 weeks later, on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt presided over his own day of infamy as he signed Executive Order 9066, entered into the Federal Register 2 days later. A stroke of FDR's pen upended my family's life and the lives of 120,000 other American citizens and legal immigrants of Japanese ancestry. The order forced the evacuation, a sterile word to describe mass arrests of 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry to prison camps. Our crime was our ancestry and nothing else. There was never a national security issue or any court charges, only historical racial prejudice. The Mineta family ended up at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. The facility was rimmed with barbed wire, and the machine gun towers and searchlights faced inward. The government said it was for our protection, but we were prisoners in our own country. A great many of the 120,000 prisoners were in camps spread across the West and in Arkansas. They lost their homes, their businesses, their farms, and their lands during the course of this confinement. Many of them never recovered what our country did to them. And yet, many of the young men still chose to enlist in the Army, most of them with their families still incarcerated in those camps for the duration of World War II. They received over 20 Congressional Medals of Honor and 4,000 Purple Hearts, all of them fighting in segregated Japanese American units. The crucial and tragic lesson to be learned about Executive Order 9066 is that Americans of Japanese ancestry had no one in positions of power and authority advocating on their behalf. They had no access, political leaders were not accountable, so constitutional guarantees gave way to public hysteria. People who should have known better and who were in positions to do better failed their responsibility. After the war, we returned to San Jose, California, and I returned to school. At San Jose High School, I was elected student body president. I was an American of Japanese ancestry who had lived in an American prison camp only 4 years earlier. And now my schoolmates, vastly Caucasian, were electing me to be their student leader. It was a short time, but it felt a long way from being in the shadow of Heart Mountain, Wyoming. After graduating from UC Berkeley, I served in the U.S. Army as an intelligence officer during the final stages of the Korean War era. After active duty, I then returned to the United States and joined my dad in the insurance business. I also became active in local politics and various causes. Based on our internment experience,
Yes.
many of the Japanese American community
Quick question.
knew we needed access to our leaders to hold them accountable. The best way to achieve that was to have a seat at the table. And what was true then is equally true today. So I served on city commissions, and in 1967, I was appointed to fill a vacancy on the San Jose City Council. 2 years later, I was elected in my own right, and in 1971, I was elected mayor of my hometown, San Jose, California, and the first person of Asian ancestry ever elected of a major city on the mainland. Again, it seemed like a long way from being in the shadow of Heart Mountain, Wyoming. The morning after the election, I went to the garage, got in the car, hit the open button to the garage door, and backed out. With each row of the garage door unfolding as it was coming down and closing, I came to realize that someone had spray painted JAP on the garage door. The shadow of Heart Mountain wasn't so far away after all. I served as mayor and later as a member of Congress and as a Secretary of Commerce for President Bill Clinton and Secretary of Transportation for President George W. Bush. A few months into President Bush's presidency, America was attacked without warning, without provocation. It was September 11th, 80 years after Pearl Harbor. Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners and flew 2 into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon. A 4th plane was headed for the Capitol or the White House, but crashed in southwestern Pennsylvania when brave passengers stormed the cockpit to overtake the hijackers. I was called immediately and was the only cabinet member who reached the White House that morning. In the underground bunker, there was Vice President Dick Cheney and National Security Advisor Condi Rice. They were speaking by a secure hookup to President Bush, who had been at a Florida elementary school. When the 3rd plane, American Airlines flight number 77, hit the Pentagon, I was on the phone to the operations executive at the FAA. I said, Monty, that's the 3rd commercial airliner used as a missile in the last hour and a half. In the armed services, they have something called a stand down. And we're going to do our own stand down. So bring down all the planes. So Monty Belger responded by saying, we will bring all the planes down per pilot discretion. And my response to Monty was, screw pilot discretion. Bring all the planes down immediately. And they were able to bring down all 6,438 airplanes in 2 hours and 20 minutes safely and without any mishap. In the aftermaths of the attack, America responded. We grieved, we went to war, we promised to bring to justice those who were responsible for what went on. But also, out of the shadows came the haters. Hate crimes were committed against Middle Easterners and Muslims, and people who were mistaken for Muslims. Mosques were vandalized, neighborhoods were terrorized, and a future president would lie about where he was and what he saw on 9/11 when he said he was in New Jersey and saw thousands of Arabs cheering when the Twin Towers came down. The specter of Executive Order 9066 was never far from my mind, nor, as it turned out, was it far from President Bush's mind either. In a cabinet meeting on October 13th, held jointly with the Senate and House leadership, both Democrats and Republicans, the president spoke about the hate crimes, about how they would not be tolerated, and settling his gaze on me, he said, we are not going to let happen today to Muslims and Arab Americans what happened to my friend Norm Mineta during World War II. 6 days after 9/11, President Bush went to a mosque and said, those who feel they can intimidate our fellow citizens, take out their anger, don't represent the best of America. They represent the worst of humankind, and they should be ashamed of that kind of behavior. And now, over 20 years later, those words are still ringing in my ears. They don't represent the best of America. They represent the worst of humankind, and they should be ashamed of that kind of behavior. Those words are ringing in my ears because those are the people I saw storming the Capitol on January 6th. January 6th was also a day of infamy. The facts are unassailable. An assault on our democracy occurred as the Capitol was attacked by a highly motivated crowd of people who broke into it and searched for prisoners, including the Vice President and the Speaker of the House. They intended to overturn a legal presidential election by force, even murder, and virtually all of them were Trump supporters, not Antifa, not insider provocateurs, nor so-called deep state malcontents. They were domestic terrorists, badly organized domestic terrorist thugs who trashed the Capitol, built gallows, attacked police officers, and then tried to deny they were even at this coup attempt. Today, as I talk to you, we are faced with two pandemics. The first is the virus called COVID-19. It makes us physically sick, and to date, the pandemic has killed over 800,000 Americans, and this number continues to climb with each new variant. The second is the pandemic of hatred and intolerance. It has attacked the body politic of our nation. It promotes lies about stolen elections. It attacks the rule of law because the judge administering it may be of Hispanic origin. It degrades women and minorities. It seeks to divide us into tribes, sow fear among us about medicine, about government, and religion. It turns frightened men and women into cowards and mean-spirited individuals into petty demagogues. It has spread into our community, the Congress, and other institutions that we revere. We've seen this disease at other times. The passage of Jim Crow laws, the Trail of Tears, the McCarthy era, the aftermath of 9/11, and once again, the rise in hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans and immigrants. It is the same sickness I witnessed standing in the shadow of Heart Mountain, Wyoming. A nation faces mortal danger when its citizens do not understand democracy and their responsibilities to ensure its success. As the classical scholar Edith Hamilton wrote about Athens, quote, "When the freedom they wished for most was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free and was never free again," unquote. And that's what this disease does. It seeks out those who are not educated about the foundation of our republic. It resists teaching us that the rule of law is a principle, not an eternal guarantee. That the peaceful transfer of power is a tradition, not a certainty. You are the nation's builders. I will continue to speak out, but I also hand over my set of tools to each of you. All of you own two things that no one else owns: your name and your integrity. Work very hard to constantly protect both of them. Combine that effort with having short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals. And don't let your concentration on the long term trip you up on something right in front of you. So, thank you for your understanding and commitment to a future of success. Re-energize your efforts to defend our Constitution and educate Americans about our democracy. Come to it with a courageous heart, a determined eye, and a steady spirit. We have been given so much, and it is our time to earn our good fortune. Thank you very much.
Powerful words from Secretary Mineta. So my name is Todd Vanadalak. I will be guiding us through the second part of our event today. So as we switch gears for that second part, a friendly reminder to share questions for our next speaker in the chat box. Also, as Hanson had mentioned earlier, if you have some comments about Secretary Mineta's presentation as well, please include that in the chat as well. And the questions for our next speaker, we will go through them at the Q&A at the very end. So our next speaker, Manjusha Kulkarni, is the Executive Director of AAPI Equity Alliance, which is a coalition of over 40 community-based organizations representing Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in LA County. Manju holds several other positions of service. She is a member of the LA City Ethics Commission, an appointed member of the California Racial and Identity Profiling Advisory Board, a lecturer in UCLA's Asian American Studies Department, and an appointed member of the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program Advisory Panel. Some of Manju's work has been featured in numerous publications, including the New York Times, CBS News, and CNN, as well as several ethnic media outlets. She testified before Congress in March 2021 at the House Judiciary Committee, speaking to the issue of anti-Asian hate, including sharing Stop AAPI Hate data and raising policy recommendations to help address the startling and very significant wave of racism and discrimination faced by AAPIs in the US. For Manju's presentation to us today, She will be focusing on her work with Stop AAPI Hate, which she co-founded with Cynthia Choi and Russell Jiang in March 2020. All three were recognized by Time Magazine as 3 of the 100 most influential individuals in 2021. Stop AAPI Hate is the nation's leading aggregator of COVID-19 related hate incidents against AAPIs. Manju received a BA in political science and a certificate in women's studies from Duke University and a JD from Boston University School of Law. Manju is an executive director, attorney, lecturer, author, leader, wife, and mother of 2. Please join me in welcoming Manju. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Todd, for that really kind and generous introduction. It's such an honor to be with you all today and to be on this panel with Secretary Mineta, who is really such a wonderful leader who, of course, hails from our community. If folks haven't seen, there's actually a wonderful documentary about him called Norm Mineta and His Legacy, an Asian American Story, which was featured on PBS a few years back. And it's a special honor to be with all of you, as you're the ones who have shaped our neighborhoods, communities, cities, states, and our nation. And it's a real pleasure to be with you and talking about our legacy, really taking the experiences that Secretary Mineta shared and also some of our findings at Stop AAPI Hate. If we can pull up the slide presentation, that'd be great. And I just want to say before I get started, a special thank you to Hing, Daniel, Hansen, and Todd, and that it's also such a small world because I actually happen to be a fangirl of the work of Todd's partner, Oyen Poon, who has really done some groundbreaking work in the education sector, really talking about how ethnic studies enhances the lives and experiences of our young people. Next slide. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is really, understanding the hate that our communities have experienced. And sadly, it's not simply that which we've seen over the last 2 years, but something that has unfortunately been with our communities for quite a long time. And you see there a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which really to me says so much about the time that we're living in, which is, it is not just the tragedy of the oppression that we're experiencing, but the silence of that. That we see from so many folks who are on our side, who believe and share our values, but have chosen not to say anything. And so it's with that sentiment in mind that I come to you today, because I think more of us do need in all of our roles to speak up. Next slide. And so what I wanted to share is just a few different examples of what the surge in COVID-19 related racism has looked like across the country. I'm not going to read the examples, but you can see them for yourself. The top one, an example of workplace discrimination. Beneath that, a physical attack or assault. Just beneath that is an incident of 2 elderly grandparents being accosted in their neighborhood, simply taking their grandchild for a walk. And then the one on the right-hand corner is really the incident that got us involved in this work, which was a middle school child here in Los Angeles was physically attacked and verbally assaulted on the schoolyard. Another student approached him, accused him of having COVID-19 and told him, go back to China. Well, the child was quite perplexed because he himself was not of Chinese origin. And so he said, I'm not Chinese, not to alienate himself from that community, but to just say, I can't go back, right? Because I'm not from there. And when he said that, he was punched in the face and head 20 times. We immediately at AAPI Equity Alliance began this work with the family and the school district, making sure that their needs were being met. And that also we held a press conference with our local leaders to essentially come together and say that we would not tolerate this behavior in our communities. Next slide. It was after that Russell Jung and Cynthia Che reached out to me. They had seen some of the media coverage of our press conference, and they were beginning to see the same things in the Bay Area. So we reached out to the Attorney General, then Javier Becerra, asked his office to collect the data, and we were told that they're not in that business, and so they don't do that. So we took it upon ourselves to create an online reporting form. And we're really rather shocked, actually, that within just a few weeks, we received several hundred incident reports from across the United States. Next slide. And so that number actually has grown to just under 11,000 between March 2020 and December 2021. And so I wanted to share with you and delve into some of the data. And you'll see here on the right, incidents are really taking a toll on vulnerable communities, and women unfortunately appear to be bearing the brunt of this racism, reporting about 62% of all incidents. 10% have been reported by youth, and then seniors 7%. And then you'll see on the left-hand corner that many of these take place in those arenas open to the public parks and public streets, and then also in private businesses, retail, et cetera, public accommodations where individuals often go to buy groceries, get their prescriptions refilled, and even buy toilet paper, right? So these are places that are open to the public, and so therefore important for us to have access to. Next slide. And so we know that verbal harassment has and continues to be the most common example of discrimination, followed by physical assaults. And let me say, though, even though physical assaults are a pretty significant number, a majority of what we are seeing are not actually hate crimes, but they are hate incidents. What is the difference between the two? A hate crime is something that is already in and of itself a crime and has a criminal element. And so in the United States, crimes are typically those that involve physical assault or battery, sexual assault or rape, and homicide. And then some of the other crimes, of course, include destruction of property. So those are the most common examples. And so if things are not a crime, they cannot be a hate crime. And yet we know that they're still traumatic and harmful. And that includes, for example, the civil rights violations, including workplace discrimination, refusal of service, and being barred or being refused access to transportation. And there are civil enforcement mechanisms for these. We also have, of course, avoidance or shunning and online harassment. Next slide. And so most of these incidents, as I said, do take place in areas open to the public. And so we, in addition to the public streets, sidewalks, and businesses, you'll see also private residences. And what's noteworthy here is schools, universities, and hospitals. We believe the numbers we've received for schools and universities were relatively small because in the last academic year, that is 2020, 2021, most schools across the country were in remote, had remote learning, and most university classes were held online or virtually. And so there was not that much actual interaction on a personal level between students or between students and teachers. Also, you'll see here a significant number, 1% being those that happen at hospitals or at medical practices. Next slide. And I just want to apologize too, I think because this is in PDF format, some of the fonts are a little bit off. I think after this presentation, you'll get to see it actually in PowerPoint, and hopefully you won't have some of those discrepancies. You'll see here that across communities, AAPIs are experiencing some of the hate and discrimination. So while we know that Chinese Americans are often the target, they represent a plurality, but not a majority of individuals who've reported to us. Other East Asians include Korean, Japanese American, then we have Filipino or Filipinx, Vietnamese, who of course hail from Southeast Asian communities. And then even those folks who are biracial and identify as both white as well as Asian American, and we allow folks to choose multiple races in our online reporting form. They have experienced hate, and then South Asians or Indian Americans, as well as even Pacific Islanders, have experienced the same type of hate as AAPIs. Next slide. And so in terms of the takeaways of our data, we know that racial discrimination affects all Asian Americans as well as Pacific Islanders, and that intersectionality also matters. That is to say, ways in which people are targeted not only for their race, but also for their gender, their sexual orientation, etc. As I mentioned before, most of the incidents reported to us are hate incidents and not hate crimes. And that's really important because, you know, as we think of policy issues, there's not a one size fits all solution. And that means that just simply turning to policing or law enforcement, criminal law enforcement, is not going to be the answer, because that's only at best going to address about 10% or so of the incidents at best. There's no one profile of perpetrators, and contrary to what you've seen in social media or in mainstream media, African Americans do not make up a majority of those who are causing harm. Finally, we know that racism is not simply that of interpersonal attacks, but also structural decisions and policy making. Next slide. So I wanted to take a moment to reflect on this quote by MacArthur genius and Pulitzer Prize winner Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's an author, was a longtime journalist and reporter at The Atlantic. And he has said, racism is the father of race. And what does that mean, right? If we look at world history, we know that really racism took hold on our planet when we began to see the mass subjugation of individuals across our planet in different ways, right? We had genocide of Native Americans here in our country. We had a global slave trade that involved individuals of African descent across Europe, South America, North America. We had settler colonialism in Africa, South America, North America, and even in South Asia, where my family comes from. And then finally, you know, when we think about that, that's when we sort of in the literature began to see these demarcations. Next slide. And when we think of actually the phenotypes, right, of race, we realize actually that it is a social construct. And you see here a variety of faces. And we know that some of those faces, which are lighter, actually hail from individuals who are African American. Some of the darker faces actually come from those who are identified in our culture and even by our census as being quote unquote white. And that within groups, that is within these races or so-called races, there's as much difference as there are across races. So if you see a light-skinned South Asian American, they may be lighter than a dark-skinned white individual. Similarly, individuals, you know, who are very dark-skinned, you know, from my community may be, in fact, darker than light-skinned African Americans. So I just want to point this out because people do tend to think of race as based on inherent physical traits, and that with those physical traits come certain characteristics, right? Immutable characteristics, and that's just simply not true. Next slide. In the United States, when we think of the racialization of Asian Americans specifically, they're in that binary of race in America, which is really often thought of as Black and white, right? We see that in the outsider context or framing, we are thought of as perpetual foreigners. So even my children who are born and raised here in the United States are asked, where are you from? Where are you really from? To denote to them and to everyone else that if you're not white, or if you have a certain complexion or certain facial structure, you are a foreigner. And of course, what comes from that is that you're suspect, you're not to be trusted, you bring disease, you bring questionable alliances, as Secretary Mineta spoke of. So that's one end of the racialization. The other end is the insider framing, which is around the model minority myth. And I'm just going to take a second to talk about this because people have heard of the model minority, but they don't know where it came from. It was coined by Professor George Peterson of UC Berkeley in 1966. And think about that time, 1966, what was going on then, right? It was the height of the civil rights movement. He created a wedge between African Americans and Asians by saying, Asian Americans, and here he was talking specifically about Japanese Americans, were a model in two respects. One is Asians did well socioeconomically, so they were a model. And he said African Americans or Black folks are a problem because they don't do well socioeconomically. Despite being a sociologist, he seemed to ignore a lot of history and of course slavery and Jim Crow and the legacies of both of those. What was interesting too that he said is that Asian Americans in his mind were a model because they basically kept their mouth shut. In his mind, they didn't speak up about the Japanese internment or incarceration, and that was a good thing, right? One, we know that's not even true, right? And many folks, including Fred Korematsu, did challenge the incarceration. But two, the fact that he said African Americans were a problem because they demanded civil rights and they demanded programs like the Great Society. So interesting in that what this has done is in some ways silenced our community, right? By wearing this badge of model minority, we've unfortunately, I think, kept our mouth shut too often or not been heard by the greater community. And I think it's as a result of this framing. Next slide. So we want to make sure in all of the presentations we do that we really debunk that model minority myth. We know our communities have experienced the second highest rates of small business closure behind African Americans, high rates of unemployment, especially long-time unemployment due to the pandemic. And we know that individuals in our community come from all socioeconomic strata, right? From very low income and low net wealth all the way to very high levels of income and high net wealth and assets. And of course, some of this comes from the legacies we bring from the homeland, right? When many of us were privileged back in the homeland because of education, economic privilege, even caste, we've been able to do well here in the United States. And of course, those folks who came from countries that were ravaged by colonialism and imperialism had to come as refugees and asylees. So of course, that's going to make a difference in terms of their ability to even make a decent living and live in safe and healthy neighborhoods and communities. Next slide. And so I want to talk for a second too about those mental health challenges. And I will tell you as a lecturer at UCLA, so many of my students have come to me speaking about these challenges, some of which, as I mentioned were brought on by that model minority framing. What we know specifically with the racism that they're experiencing and we are experiencing as a community is that 20% of individuals who've experienced the racism actually display what's called racial trauma. And these are symptoms, heightened symptoms of depression, anxiety, stress, even physical symptoms, and that often these are strongly correlated or associated with PTSD. 72% have reported that the discrimination is actually their greatest source of stress, not even the pandemic or the virus. Thankfully, 28%, and these are individuals who reported to us, have said that they felt a reduction in their symptoms just simply after reporting. So we are heartened by that information and glad that they see our website and the work we're doing as part of the solution. Next slide. So I want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the history. Of course, Secretary Mineta talked about the incarceration. There's so many other aspects, though, unfortunately, that we're not aware of, right? From the Naturalization Act, which granted US citizenship only to those who are free white persons in 1790, the Page Act that actually prohibited women of Chinese origin from coming to the United States, labeling them prostitutes and whores, and for that reason saying they couldn't come to the US. The Chinese Exclusion Act, many of us are aware of, that suspended immigration and prohibited future, for many decades, future Chinese from coming to the United States. Alien land laws in places like California, which stole millions of dollars of wealth from our community members simply because they were not United States citizens, which they couldn't be because of the Naturalization Act, stole it from them. The Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917 prevented folks from much of Asia from coming to the United States. And it was really until 1965 that that was not lifted, until the time in which that was truly lifted. You even had efforts to send, quote, people back, and through the Filipino Repatriation Act. Next slide. And then you see additional evidence of racist policies in terms of the colonialization in the Pacific Islands, the continued anti-Asian sentiments early on related back to the bubonic plague and other diseases. There was anti-Southeast Asian sentiment related to the Vietnam War. And then as you move into the decades in which many of us have lived, we've seen the murder of Vincent Chin just the night before his wedding when he was killed by two auto workers who were given 0 prison time for beating him to death because they confused him with a Japanese American and they were upset by the competition created by Japanese American auto companies. More recently, we have the mass profiling and surveillance of Sikh, Muslim, and other South Asian community members, including a program called Special Registration, which caused 80,000 individuals in the United States, caused them to register just simply because they were Muslim and male, akin to what happened to, we know, Jewish folks during the Holocaust. Then 13,000 of those individuals were put into detention and deportation proceedings. And there were exactly 0 cases of terrorism that were found after that, 0, not a single one. And then of course we have the rise of anti-Asian hate and sadly a year ago, the Atlanta shootings. Next slide. Now what we've also had is a history of resistance and unity. And so that we know that in those times, even of exclusion, we've gotten together with other communities. We know that there's been joint resistance to the incarceration. that with the farm worker movement, many folks have, of course, heard of Cesar Chavez, but don't know that he worked closely with Larry Itliong from the Filipino community on that worker rights movement. Of course, in the civil rights movement, you see folks in that small photo wearing leis that were brought to them by a Pacific Islander priest to show solidarity of PI community members. We've had Third World Liberation Front, and more recently, of course, coming together against 9/11. We saw many Japanese Americans joining forces with Muslim Americans to fight that profiling and surveillance. And many of us have come together, of course, with our African American sisters and brothers to fight for Black lives, especially in the wake of the George Floyd murder and so much of that police violence that we've seen day in and day out. Next slide. And so what I want to encourage folks to think of is, that political rhetoric that drives some of the anti-Asian animus, right? And unfortunately, it comes, some of it from both sides of the aisle. So we know that even President Biden ordered an investigation into what was a ridiculous and absolutely unsubstantiated lab leak theory. He did have it investigated, and of course there was nothing whatsoever found of that connecting COVID to the leak in a Wuhan lab. We also know that individuals have called for Chinese, that is, candidates have called for Chinese students to be banned from US universities, including those specifically in Texas. The China Initiative has taken some of the rhetoric, not only from President Trump, but others in his party, and weaponized it to have mass profiling and surveillance of Chinese scientists and researchers. And Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene said she would deport every single Chinese person in the United States. So we know that, even comments like Kung Flu, Wuhan virus, and China virus were not isolated statements that came from former President Trump, but really are part of what this ecosystem has become. When we studied the rhetoric in our data, we found that 28% of incidents involve some of the same type of statements made by our political leaders, and they were weaponized against everyday citizens and residents of the United States. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, we have policies then against our community members. That includes continued mass deportations of Southeast Asians, specifically Vietnamese and Cambodians. That's continued under the Biden administration. We have FBI surveillance. And unfortunately, what we also have too is programs like Public Charge that really seek to demonize those immigrant community members who are simply seeking food stamps, healthcare, et cetera. That was something that was brought back by the Trump administration. And I've seen myself at my former organization where women seeking prenatal care when they're pregnant refused to even go to the doctor because they were worried about public charge. And these are lawful residents. They're not even undocumented folks, but they would not go to see a doctor because they were worried about being deported or being prevented from becoming US citizens by these policies. Next slide. So in terms of our coalition's approach, it's fivefold. We seek to serve as the nation's leading aggregator of anti-Asian and Pacific Islander hate incidents. We're offering multilingual resources, which are on our website, and I encourage everyone to go to stopaapihate.org. We also encourage you to report incidents that you've experienced. In fact, sadly, my husband and I experienced one a few weeks ago, and so he reported it on the website because it was someone yelling racial slurs at us at a gas station a few miles from our house here in Los Angeles. providing technical assistance from rapid response to preventive measures, as well as supporting those community-based safety measures and restorative justice practices. And then I wanted to add number 5, which is advocacy at local, state, and national levels. We've been very fortunate to share our data with directly with President Biden, Vice President Harris, as well as Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, the Attorney General of California, as well as several attorneys general at a national conference. We've also shared with them policy recommendations of what we need to do moving forward. And that's a lot of our focus now, which is not simply to share the data, but to offer solutions to address what's happening and prevent it from happening again. Next slide. Apologies, my dog has very strong opinions of these issues. And in terms of our core issues, we know that they reside in civil rights, community safety, and educational equity. And so we want to make sure that we hold institutions and systems accountable to protect our community members. And there are opportunities aside from criminal law enforcement to ensure that people are not discriminated against when they go to the store, when they work in their jobs, when they live in their apartments. And there are not only strong laws, but mechanisms for redress, from departments of fair employment and housing to departments of justice all across our country. There are community safety practices that we can put into place to make sure our housing is safe, our public transit. Having educational equity, as I mentioned at the outset, is so important. We need to know and understand our histories and to be incorporated into what our kids learn about every single day, right? And unfortunately, right now we're seeing attacks, even in the latest Supreme Court nominees hearing, seeing those attacks against just teaching anti-racist ideas to our students. Next slide. And when we did a survey of 1,000 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, it was done by the Edelman Communications firm. These are what community members told us were the most important avenues for them. And we're thankful that they actually are the very same ones we've come up with ourselves, which are in the area of education, in the area of community-based solutions, and in the arena of civil rights legislation and enforcement. You see there lower numbers for more law enforcement, and even lower numbers for some of the other areas in terms of leaders speaking out. So we feel heartened that we are really taking what are the most effective approaches as deemed by our community members. Next slide. And so these are just a few of those recommendations, and we have 3 bills currently in the California legislature that look at addressing public transit and rider safety on public transit. Number 2, looking at street harassment from a public health perspective. We know that Rochelle Walensky, the head of the CDC, has said that racism is in fact one of the greatest public health threats in America today. And the last is ensuring and strengthening our civil rights protections in businesses, allowing people an easy mechanism to report when they've been discriminated, and then enabling them to get redress, to get financial penalties where appropriate, and for employees to be trained in what to do when this happens and to be held accountable if they engage in the racism. Next slide. So as I close, I just want to thank you all for listening. These are a few of our websites, my contact information. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today, and really also appreciate the dialogue that we have in the chat box, and open to taking any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Manju, for your presentation. I'll give you a minute to catch your breath and maybe a sip of water before we jump into the Q&A. And also thank you for the kind words for my wife. I'm sure her ears were burning She's downstairs actually conducting her own meeting. As you know, changing the world is an ongoing endeavor and never ends. So that's what she's doing. Your presentation was excellent. It was highly informative, very eye-opening, but also I think it really adds a spark to our hearts to continue working towards peace and change in the communities that we serve. And as Hing noted earlier, before everyone actually joined in, this was kind of earlier before the event started, but Hing had noted that you are actually very well respected in the field of urban planning, as you were listed among the American Planning Association's list of 12 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who shaped our cities in 2021. I'll actually share the link in the chat so that people can all see that article from Planning Magazine. But we are certain you will continue to hold steady on that list for years to come and continue to inspire us as planners and designers in the work that we do. And then thank you all for the comments in the chat. It's been very lively. So I am actually going to turn off my video because I think that might help with my audio, but I will continue speaking. But thank you all for the comments in the chat. Many attendees have been sharing their own experiences of hate incidences, as well as anti-Asian sentiments that actually were codified in our municipal codes and ordinances. That was actually very fascinating to read. Some attendees like Omar have been sharing video links to share as well, including a PSA from WWE superstar John Cena, of all people, someone that some of us know. But thank you all for sharing comments and links and stories, and please continue to do so. I will tease out relevant questions to ask Manju in our limited time for the Q&A. However, we will be saving the chat comments to share with you, Manju, and we may be sharing those as well with participants later once we get it all downloaded and saved. For the first question for you, Manju, and there are two somewhat related questions. This is from one of our attendees, Pat. Pat asks, do schools track incidents of racial or ethnic slurs reported? And second question was, what can we do to help our local school districts hold these conversations with students and their parents? Kids can still change their minds much more easily than adults. That was our first set. Yeah.
Great question. And I have a few answers to that. One is, and I'll try to include it in the chat, in 2020 and in 2021, we held a youth internship program of 100 young people each year. It was virtual, who in 2020, each student in the program spoke with 10 of their friends and classmates, and together they compiled the data and came up with their own solutions for what they want to see happen in their schools. And so to me, that was so important to hear from young people about what they need, right? So it's not just coming from us as adults, but they are telling us what their experiences are in schools. And each of these 9 kids are essentially almost 1,000 young people who were interviewed, talked about their experiences with hate, and then gave their recommendations. We also shared the data from Stop AAPI Hate and came up with our own, and surprisingly or not, they were very similar with each other. So I'm going to share that. I think there's so much that can be done. And by the way, the name of that report is They Blame Me Because I'm Asian. So how awful and sad to think that, for our young people, our kids, we often hear from conservative senators like, oh my, it's awful when kids have to engage in conversations about racism, they're too young. Well, what about our kids who are experiencing the racism when they're very young? Right, from K through 12, experiencing that, and that's what they've talked about in this report. So when we think of solutions, I would say that obviously at the PTA level, ensuring that perhaps there are events that are inclusive of all of the kids at our schools. At the school board level, ensuring that the curriculum that is taught is one that's inclusive. We know that there are bills across our country that are including ethnic studies or Asian American studies, including in the Asian American studies in Illinois, in New Jersey, I believe Connecticut is next. And in California, we now have enacted ethnic studies in the K through 12 curriculum. These efforts are really important. Also, I think for a lot of folks, when they haven't been involved in this work, we have a template resolution, which can be used not only for city councils, but also for school districts to just start off to level set in terms of the fact that we all agree that hate is not acceptable. And you may be surprised to learn that a lot of school districts and cities can't even agree to that. There have been a number of cities where city council have tried to pass these type of resolutions, and they've been met with opposition because others say, you know what, I should be able to say what I want. I should be able to engage in whatever activities I want, regardless of how they detrimentally impact Asian Americans or people of color. But I think it's a good way to start the work because at least you know who your friends are, you know who your opponents are. And then if it does pass, we can get to more meaningful and substantive ordinances across municipalities and school districts.
Great, thank you, Manju. Another question that came up in the chat is from William. He asked, do you see a difference in the level of discrimination by type of community design, whether urban, suburban, or rural, and cities with, I guess second part of the question is, in cities with public places that bring people together versus cities that lack public places?
That's a great question. We have looked at it a little bit. Here's what I can tell you is that those areas with large Asian American and Pacific Islander populations do themselves have high numbers, right? And I think what that tells us is that, you know, of course, even though we think we may be sheltered by having large numbers, it also means that we're just essentially going to be targeted, even as I was, and my husband was here in Los Angeles, right? A city that's incredibly diverse. Hate resides everywhere. So we have seen higher numbers from cities than we have from rural areas, but I think that's really in proportion to the number or percentage of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So again, when we look at the state data, California is the highest, but then of course we also tend to have the largest population of AAPIs. New York is next, followed by some of the other large states. So that's essentially my answer in terms of what we see. Unfortunately, we haven't necessarily been able to do any further study of that, but I would certainly welcome opportunities to for our organization to partner with you all to look at some of this data and also to develop those policy solutions.
Just a minute.
Great, thank you, Manju. We have about, I was just looking at the time, we have about 9 minutes left. So we still have some time for questions. So I encourage people to continue asking questions in the chat box. But I wanted to raise one question that I had in terms of, I was really glad that you talked about mental health aspects of what hate incidences do in our communities, both as a community, but also at the individual level. So I guess the question I had was, for those who are managing or will manage their lives coping with trauma from hate incidences, what types of spaces should we plan and design, since we are most of the audience is planners and designers? For example, healing gardens and walking paths are two common safe spaces to manage one's mental health. Are there other healing spaces that we should be looking at or considering? Any that are culturally sensitive or specific?
That's a terrific question, Todd. And one that I would actually ask your advice on in terms of, because you all are the experts and I don't pretend to be, what we have seen as strategies that work are those resources and services to community members. And to the extent that there are not public spaces available for healing, right? I think opportunities in the planning sector to make more of those available. I think we, in many of our urban areas still have a lack of greenery, green spaces, and we still have way too much, concrete and concrete jungles in and around us. And so I would just say that absolutely finding ways to do that. And, I have been heartened by, even here in Southern California, ways in which we have sort of those, I don't know the technical term for it, but the kind of walking gardens or walking green spaces, so that it's not simply just about big parks, but maybe even some of those parks that are alongside major streets and thoroughfares, so people have easy access to them as well. And I would say too, one thing we've seen, and I did get a chance to work on earlier on, is just access to some of the parks. We know that, for example, in terms of policies, sometimes we see that basketball courts are not lit up at night, right? And that has certain racial implications and even potentially racialized or racist intent, right? So the baseball court might be lit up, or a baseball diamond, but the basketball court will not. The cost of going to some of our parks, right? The parking involved, or the fact that they're not accessible by public transit. That tends to be true here in LA. Some of the best parks in our region are not easily accessed by public transit. And even with the national parks, I will say that there's not been outreach done to communities of color. We have a great national park, the San Gabriel National Monument, and very few people of color frequent that park. They don't even know about it, even though there's such a large population of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders just at the foot of that national park.
Great, thank you, Manju. I do want to turn it back over to Hing to close us out. We do have one other question in the chat, but I'll let Hing let us know if we have time for that, or if he needs us to close out.
Yeah,
So,
go ahead with
back to
that
you.
final question, and I'll end it in just a few minutes.
Okay, sure. So our last question is from Pat. So the question is, are there recommendations of what us as API Americans in the field of city planning should do to help our communities be more inclusive?
I think, to the extent that we can really interrogate some of those policies and think about ways in which that racism has been with us. I shared in the chat a piece I wrote for Nextdoor, essentially connecting the dots between even my own family's home, one in which you can look at the old CCNRs and find that until fairly recently, people of color were not allowed to live in my neighborhood, right? So connecting those dots and really exposing the trauma that caused and the long-term consequences on wealth. There are wonderful books about sort of the color of wealth, a report that was done by the Federal Reserve, the color of law, talking about some of those zoning laws and ordinances. And I think some of them continue to be true even today, even though they're not using explicit racialized language. They will use code terminology to prevent low-income folks and communities of color from residing in, taking part in those spaces. And so that's what I would say, is to really sort of begin to interrogate, how do we create spaces that allow for all of us to access and all of us to essentially reach self-actualization, right? By living in safe neighborhoods, sending our kids to, good schools, and being able to even just breathe fresh air, right? All of you take a significant and critical role in all of that. And so I want to express both my appreciation and put out a challenge to you. This is going to be even more important in the years ahead as our demographics continue to change, and to ensure that we really allow equity for all communities.
Well, thank you, Manju, for such a tremendous presentation. This is really exciting to hear, and I think it helped us to understand a little bit more. Shay, unfortunately, we won't be able to pull you up for a question, but you could type your question in. We'll relay that to either Manju or to Mineta's team. Well, as I just mentioned, I feel now more energized, having learned some history, as well as how to be more aware and react to hostilities toward me because of my race and ethnicity. We're extremely grateful for both Secretary Mineta and Manju's talk to us. We hope that you've not only enjoyed these presentations, but also will become more active in our communities. As mentioned earlier, this session has been recorded and we'll make it become available once we get the recording all set up. We already have permission from Manju to send out her PowerPoint presentation as a PDF to all the attendees. We'll send out next week. And we've also reached out to Secretary Mineta's team to see if we could send out the transcript of his talk. We'll find out about that probably by next week. For those who are AICP, you'll be pleased to hear that this event has been approved for 1 CM credit. Additionally, there is also 1 equity credit attached to that 1 CM credit. So again, for those who are AICP. Our Asian and Pacific Islander interest group may be new, but we plan to be active in serving APA planners and our Asian and Pacific Islander community. Our next in-person activity will be at the National Planning Conference, also known as NPC 22 in San Diego. On Saturday, April 30th at 3:30 p.m., we will meet in National City. This is the city that's just south of San Diego for a tour and presentation at a new food mart and housing project. On Sunday, May 1st at noon, we will conduct our first business meeting. And on Wednesday, May 25th, we will celebrate AAPI Heritage Month, which will be another online event. So if you didn't catch all the information, don't worry. Look right above my name. There's a couple URLs there. The second one has the information for you to become a member of our interest group. And if you're a member of our interest group, you will be receiving emails on all these events. So if you're not a member, please go to the link above and fill out our survey. Once you complete the survey, you'll automatically become a member. There are no dues or fees for our interest group. We appreciate you joining today's presentation, and we look forward to seeing you at future activities. Have a great day and a wonderful weekend. Bye now.